Once you understand the principle that the Bible is a library of books rather than a single book, it has countless liberating consequences. That's why this week I'm going to take a look at the Apostle Paul and his letters, which make up, as you know, a significant part of the entire New Testament. Paul was and still is often written off as an anti-sex, anti-marriage, anti-woman misery. But it's even worse than that. Because, for instance, if you take the Catholic Church's 12th century decision to make celibacy compulsory for all their priests, or the modern practice in parts of the evangelical church of insisting that congregations must be led by men, the tragic consequences of both these decisions echo out in the lives of too many people, all born out of, in major part, in my view, the misguided belief that all of Paul's words are universally applicable to all people at all times. Now just take one example of how this works. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul writes famously, "It's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." And then he continues, "Now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it's good for them to stay unmarried as I do. I wish that all of you were as I am. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion. Now about the virgins, because of the present crisis, I think it's good for a man to remain as he is." And then Paul concludes, "Those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you from this." But when we regard every word of Paul as universally applicable, we make, I believe, an horrendous pastoral mistake, because we end up imposing theological constructs on him and then ourselves which he would have never owned. As the great New Testament scholar James Dunn, friend of Tom Wright, explains, Paul would have been appalled that so many of his letters set in particular situations have been generalized 20 centuries later as one-size-fits-all universal advice. That's why some of Paul's writing can seem to us to be confusing, or even to be contradictory with principles set out elsewhere in other Pauline letters, let alone in the plain teaching of Jesus. Take as an example of this the advice given in the Pauline letter to Titus. Check it out for yourself. In chapter 1, verses 12 and 13, we read this: "One of Crete's own prophets has said, Cretins are always liars, evil brutes, and lazy gluttons." And then it adds, "This saying is true. Therefore," it says, "rebuke them sharply so that they will be sound in the faith." Is this really God's assessment of all the people of the island of Crete for all time? If so, I disagree. I was there just a couple of summers ago with my wife, and I found many Cretans, the majority of them, who were wonderfully helpful, generous, and very hard-working. So how do we deal with all this? Some years ago, I found myself in the position where, aside from leading Oasis Developing Work, I was also serving as the leader of 2 separate local churches in different parts of South London. They were both small and only about 4 or 5 miles apart. But they had completely different histories, memberships, and cultures. I often used to smile to myself as I thought that if anyone ever listened to the advice I gave to one church and then tried to apply it to the other, it would be a disaster. The guidance I was trying to bring to both was based on exactly the same Jesus-centered principles, but because of the different contexts, issues, opportunities, and people involved, my advice was often quite different, and occasionally would have even seemed, to a person who was trying to turn my practical advice into some kind of overarching theology, even contradictory. Every one of Paul's letters is what the theologians call occasional, which doesn't mean they were infrequent or sporadic, but rather that they were written on specific occasions, to specific congregations or individuals in response to specific pastoral issues and situations. Each is part of a relationship, a conversation with people he knows. They're not systematic theology. I'll say that again. They are not systematic theology, a fact which undercuts the efforts on the part of some to establish extensive theological positions based largely on a verse or two of his writings alone, lifted out of local context. And this is the key to understanding Paul's advice in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 about Christians remaining single. It's exactly that, pastoral advice shaped by specific local circumstances. Although birth control strategies existed in Paul's day, they didn't work very well. So Paul's advice against marriage wasn't anti-sex, as parts of the church later taught. He's been far more practical and down to earth than that. Instead, the reason Paul gives to those in the Corinthian church for avoiding marriage, if they can, is, as he explains, the present crisis. So, what does the present crisis, the present distress, mean? Well, we know from first century Roman historians such as Pliny and Suetonius and Tacitus that there were severe food shortages and rioting in Corinth and other parts of the Roman world in the middle of the first century, all caused by a series of famines. And we also know that Paul's heartfelt recommendation for the single life was, as we just said and heard, a response to the present distress, and to spare, as he puts it, his readers from the troubles he knows will come to those who marry. Raising children in a famine-ridden and volatile city would be a hazardous business. Now, some argue that Paul's attitude is as much to do with his expectation of the imminent return of Christ as with the crisis caused by the famine. But in truth, his main motivation, as he states explicitly, is the present distress, the specific local situation, rather than the future, even though this belief, which it turns out was misplaced, seems to form the wider backdrop of his comments. But one last very important point. In recognising all this, we have to be careful not to slip into the idea that all of Paul's ethical teaching is merely situational and is only applicable in a specific situation. That, in my opinion, would be to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Paul is a follower of Jesus, not vice versa, of course. All of his work, therefore, is built around his understanding of the values of Jesus and his desire to work out practically how to apply these universal truths that never change into particular pastoral situations. So, some questions. What do you think are the underlying universal principles, Jesus-centered principles, that sit behind Paul's writing? How do we apply these to our local and often complex communities today? I'll see you next week.